Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another episode of Catching-101 TV. My name is Zan Barksdale. Excited about today's guest. He's actually a neighbor of mine almost. He lives about 45 minutes down the road in Lexington, Kentucky. He's currently the minor league catching coordinator for the Minnesota Twins. Played baseball at UK right down the road from me, and I've known him. He's been at CatcherCon a number of times, and a really bright, smart catching guy that I'm interested to speak with and learn a little bit more from. So Michael Thomas, welcome to the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Zan. Glad I could hop on here with you.
Well, it'd be nice to do this thing in person since we're only 45 minutes away, but I guess with the world the way it is, Zoom meetings are something we're all getting used to, but definitely appreciate the time. And as we were speaking about briefly before we kind of started recording, I know it's a busy time of year for you with spring training starting up soon. But kind of before we get into all that stuff, I'd love for you just to kind of let the listeners know, where you came from, what you do, and maybe what some of your roles are with the Twins.
Yeah, I'm still relatively young in this thing. I'm only 29, turned 30 in a couple of weeks, and haven't been doing it for an incredibly long time. But been fortunate enough to meet some awesome people that have kind of helped me and guide me along the way. I had a small stint in college baseball for a little bit. Spent the majority of my career, I would say, at this point in professional baseball, all of it with the Twins, and took the coordinator role actually last offseason. So this is my first year this previous year, and enjoying it, loving it. The guys are great. I think having those relationships coming into the position has been really cool. I think a different perspective than probably most have, and it's kind of helped make the transition for those guys just as seamless as I felt like it was for me, with those being in place there. So excited to see what the future holds and ready to get back out there.
Well, that's awesome, man. First of all, happy early birthday. I know you said that that's coming up soon, so
Appreciate
happy
it.
birthday for that. But, and I do want to talk about, a lot of what's going on in the minor leagues and just to let everybody kind of know a little bit of backstory. I know things are dynamic and changing right now, but as of right now, we're filming in the early to mid-January. Spring training, big league spring training typically starts middle of February, and then minor league guys usually show up a couple weeks after that. What's your schedule looking like right now? How is that going to? And you may not know exactly, and that's okay. But what's 2021 looking like?
Yeah, to a large degree, I really don't know yet. But I can tell you what I'm kind of planning on and just to being prepared for. Um, as of yesterday, it seems like big league camp's going to start on time. I know in the past we've had coordinators come down. I'm still planning on that and to kind of see what happens if it if it ends up being that those guys don't need me down there for that portion of the year. Then I'll just be more invested in into this piece of it with the guys, getting them on call, seeing what they're up to, trying to get us prepared as much as we can for whenever our minor league camp starts. I don't think there's anything beneficial on that end yet, but just trying to coordinate as much as I can in terms of a plan to post big league camp to get down there with those guys.
Yeah, perfectly understandable. Like I read an article the other day that said, or they were speculating that minor league guys are going to show up about a month later than normal. So I don't know. I guess time will tell, and we'll find out. One interesting thing that I wanted to speak with you about, since you're a coordinator, and again, I'm assuming that most people who are listening or watching this maybe understand what that role is, but you basically oversee all the minor league catchers. And with 2020 being the crazy year and seasons being shortened or eliminated and guys, going back home and training, what has been different, I guess, in 2020 with the Zoom calls and communicating with guys that might have been a little bit different than what guys did in the past? And I've talked to a couple guys in pro ball, and it seems like the communication piece has really gotten better. As far as, I don't know if you have, catching wide calls with everybody on there, but it seems like a lot of the teams are doing a better job communicating with their guys, over the course of the off season. What does the communication with you and the minor league guys look like, and kind of how has that maybe changed? I know it's always changing right now, but I'm just curious to know how you guys communicate with the guys and what their focus has been since last year was kind of shortened.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think we've been in a position where we've had to overemphasize the communication. We've had to overemphasize that feedback loop working. I don't want to say um, quicker necessarily, but on a more consistent basis with a larger group. I think sometimes when we get to the affiliates, guys spend time with their affiliate coaches. They dive in on a certain thing. A coordinator pops into town, and then maybe it's 3 or 4 weeks, and they see through video. But I think they're being able to consistently just communicate with guys over Zoom, whether it's see video and have something set up on that front, or through game calling meetings and really educating on that piece. Because I think without having games, that's an incredibly tough thing. And finding ways to be creative there to get guys invested into become better at that and create their own process, I think huge. So I think it's definitely made us as a group do a couple of things differently, understand that we can communicate with our guys like more widely and regularly, as well as potentially change what our off season looks like. I think before that's been something that everybody regularly tries to change or restructure or trying to find ways to better implement things. And I think if over the past, let's say 10 months, like I think we had a perfect test run at that kind of, or we were put in a position to have to do it. And I think that has probably allowed us on a large front to be super creative and figure out ways to use this time more effectively.
Do you think in the future, the coming, let's say, let's be optimistic and say 2021 is off to a much more normal season than last year. Would you still see yourself doing some of the same things next off season that you met, I don't know if learned is the right word, but maybe some new things we've kind of had to adapt and try some new things. Will you continue to do some of that stuff in the future?
Absolutely. And not only just even during the off season, I think there's some things that we could potentially use during season. I think whether or not it's getting guys on a call once a week when we haven't been there in a while, or because of something's pulling us in some other direction, or it's checking in on a more consistent basis, or being involved in their game calling process on a more consistent basis. I think there's going to be things that we can do during the season as well. And I think the off season is going to hopefully look completely different than it ever has prior to 2020 for us, and probably for the large group of people.
Yeah, I'm excited to see. I it's easy to see all the negatives, but at the end of the day, the people who
Mm-hmm.
are creative, they're the ones that survive and they're the ones that do well. Obviously, I got a lot of respect for what you do and what the Twins do. I felt like there was a long time when every time I logged on to Twitter, I saw a Twins logo and somebody said, "I'm happy to announce that I'm with the Twins now." I feel like the Twins are just snatching up coaches and talent left and right. So that's a testament to you and the organization you're with, because they're definitely, taking that step and really thinking outside the box. And at least in my mind, the Twins are doing a great job with that. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to pick your brain on it, because I know you guys are definitely being creative and definitely doing everything you can to make the most out of the guys' time and be efficient with it. So
For sure. I it's funny. I felt the same way there for a while, but I think we've hired some really good dudes. So
yeah,
done a good job.
no doubt, man. You're definitely surrounded by a lot of other good coaches as well. So I want to get into the X's and O's and talk receiving and talk all the stuff we're, interested in. One thing that I'll be curious to know, since you've spent a little bit of time, around college ball and you spent some time in pro ball now, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening that might not have that firsthand experience that you have would love to know, what are the exact differences that you see between, the amateur catchers and the professional catchers you're working with. What sets them apart? And I know it's a very broad and general question, but maybe if there's a young player listening or a coach that coaches in high school, if you had to give me advice or maybe just some observations you've noticed, what's the difference between the guys in pro ball and the amateur guys?
That's a really good question. I think the biggest difference for me, just totally outside the physical skill level, I think there are a lot of really, really talented amateur baseball players. And I think every guy that we have at the professional level is obviously there for a reason. But I think the thing that ultimately separates, amateur players from professional players, and like, good or average professional players are the guys who end up making it, are just their work ethic. I think most importantly, like, their sleep nutrition is like a very valuable piece of their daily life. It's not just something that they think they're going to pick up down the road. They make it important earlier on in their career, and then they understand what truly makes them good. They know who they are as a player. They don't try to almost be outside the box of who they are. They do the things they do well, and they try to do them to their best ability. Do we try to push and get guys to grow in certain areas? 100%. But I think within that, we also don't try to get them to do things that are just totally outside the capabilities of who they are, right? And allow them to be really successful at what they do extremely well. So I think sometimes amateur players think they need to be like the total 5-tool, like they need to be able to do everything versus like, hey, what am I really good at now? Let me be really, really good at that. And let's try to pull up everything else just enough with that's within the capabilities of what I'm able to do. If you're a small dude and you're going to hit for more average and probably hit some more doubles, like I'm not telling you you're going to go out and drop 30 bombs. So I think I think to me that just understanding is a huge difference when you get those guys, especially when they first come in to when they get to later in their career.
I think that's an absolute perfect answer. I agree with you 100%. I feel like self-awareness is something that a lot of athletes lack. And it's hard. Everybody wants to be, like you said, the 5-tool player. You want to hit for power and hit for average and have the arm and receive and do this and that. But at the end of the day, there's very, very few guys that really are the, this is my air quotes, total package, so to speak. When you can understand your strengths and weaknesses and play towards your strengths and weaknesses, I think that's a valuable asset. And I think guys that are able to do that find success a lot sooner than guys who, like, perfect example you gave, want to be a power hitter, but hey, I hit, my exit velocity is not what it needs to be. I hit one home run last year, and this year I think I'm going to hit 20. You can't have that approach, So that's a good lesson for a lot of the amateur guys, is to really just be introspective and reflect on what you do well, and also take, I don't know if criticism or critique is the right word, but talk to your coaches, talk to the people around you, talk to if you're involved with scouts at all or other, people who are knowledgeable in baseball. I think that's a really good takeaway that a lot of people can benefit from hearing. So I'm glad you shared that for sure. Now I do want to get into I want to pick your brain and really get into the X's and O's and the receiving stuff. But before we said that, you've already mentioned pitch calling twice. That's one of those, topics that gets brought up a lot, and it's kind of an abstract area. I've always said there's kind of an art and a science to it. But how do you and your organization attack teaching catchers how to better call their game? Because I know that's one thing that a lot of amateur players want to get better at, because maybe their coach is calling the game, and they want to call the game themselves, and they want to learn, and they want to be able to showcase that they're capable of doing it. But it's a double-edged sword. If you're not doing it, how do you showcase that you're better at it? So I would just love to know, what do you do with those minor league guys that help them improve at pitch calling?
It's funny, like the game calling space is always something that I've always kind of rattled my head with a little bit. And even doing some of the stick and ball stuff, like I made a comment, like, we always talk about how guys aren't good game callers. Oh, this guy can't call a game. He can't put down the right numbers. And it's like, well, hey, have we ever taught him or given him this space to learn and grow in that area? If not, then we can't say that he's not good, or he just doesn't know. And so what we try to accomplish is to make things super simple, give the larger group big picture characteristic takeaway. I think first and foremost, and this is really at any level, if we're talking about a high school kid all the way up to probably the big leagues, if they don't have an advanced understanding of who's on the mound, or really an understanding at all, they're already putting themselves behind. I think a lot of time young players, amateur players, they spend so much time on how can we get the hitter out? What does the hitter do that says we should get him out? And the pitcher's potentially just not capable of accomplishing those things, right? And so allowing our guys to understand, like, hey, who's on the mound? We are in a space in baseball which we know so much about players in general. Let's take advantage of the guys that are on our own team, mm-hmm. and understand of who's on the mound, what can he do, what's he capable of doing, and attack it from that space, and then work from there. Because everything else past that ends up just being bonus. And so, but at the same time, keeping it super simple, big picture, quick takeaways. And as they continue to grow as a player, then we can start to layer the approach, but not making it overcomplicated. I think sometimes we overcomplicate this process, which it is tough, but it's tough because of the information. What can we take from the information and keep it simple?
I'm so glad you said that. You know, I have this conversation a lot with people, and you know, I'd say one of the biggest areas people fight me on when I have that conversation with them is they say, "Well, I'm not in a big time college. All our games aren't on TV. I don't have all the resources. I don't have enough video of the other teams." And it's like, well, hang on a minute. Let's pump the brakes. You don't need near as much video of the other teams if you really have a good understanding of what your guy on the mound can do. If you know your pitcher's strengths and weaknesses, you know really well. You know what they can execute, what they can't execute. That's I think way more than half the equation. Like you
Yeah.
put it perfectly. Like if you're asking your guy to do something that he's not capable of doing, that's a you problem. Like that's my fault for not understanding that he's not capable of doing that. So I absolutely agree
Yep.
with having a firm understanding of the guys on your staff first, and then kind of attacking the hitters on their weaknesses maybe after that. In a minor league setting where you have, I guess, 6 different teams from AAA to rookie ball or so, are you mostly speaking with guys about the pitchers that are on their current roster, or would you be talking about guys that are in the big leagues, or would you be talking about guys that might be preparing them for their next step, maybe advancement from high A to double A?
It's a tough thing to do to like restructure a roster and say like, hey, here's who you're going to be catching
Mhm.
in 5 months, because you just don't know if that's going to be the case. So we try to use examples that um, are good examples, guys that everybody knows. And it could be a big leaguer, it could be somebody within the organization. And not saying that the kid who we just drafted is going to catch a guy who spent the past 5 years in AAA, but he can learn a lot from just understanding how he works,
Mhm.
because he can put the same attributes, the same tools that he's gaining or learning to say, hey, I understand how pitcher A is, and I may never see him, I may never catch him in my career, but I can use the same things and the same tools that I have figured out how he works with pitcher B, who I know I'm going to have or I'm going to see in 2 months. So I think the examples, like, we try to use them effectively to like for everybody to understand who they are, to know, to have an idea, but it's not perfect by any means.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good start though. You know, like I said,
Mhm.
if there's a guy in your big league club that all the guys in the minor leagues are obviously going to know, which they're probably watching ESPN every night. They know every starter and every reliever. I think that's a really good way to attack that. And I think the same principles can be applied, you know, at colleges and younger. You know, you don't have to know specifically. It's more about principles and what we would do in a situation like this. Maybe not this exact situation. So that's good. That's good info, man. I always like talking about calling pitches because it's an interesting thing that I feel like doesn't get talked about nearly enough. And I feel like it's kind of one of those just voids out there where there's not a lot of information for guys who are really wanting to attack it and get better at it. So definitely appreciate you sharing that. You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
over the past, I'd say year or 2 years, or maybe even a little bit longer than that, it seems like receiving is, you know, definitely the hot topic or the most interesting thing that people want to learn about. Overall, what would be the philosophy that you've kind of set forward for your minor league guys? You know, what are their goals and what are they trying to achieve, or maybe what are their you know, principles receiving wise that you would like to try to instill in them?
I think everybody said, or I say everybody, but we've set out with this goal, with this accomplishment. Hey, listen, we want to be the best receiving organization we can possibly be. And we've done a relatively good job of pushing the status quo for not only ourselves, but um, I think comparing ourselves around the league a little bit. And for us, it's how can we put ourselves in the best position to be the best receiver we can be at all times. I think our guys have a really good understanding that that's where our value is created. They have a really good understanding that that's where we can have the largest impact in the game. A lot of it's just because of a pure quantity standpoint in terms of just an economy of what we do the most. Um, but we spend a lot of time there, and it's understanding the positions that we need to get in. It's understanding why we're getting into those positions, not just saying like, hey, we need to do this with our hand or move our body this certain way. It's like, well, why exactly are we doing it? Understanding that what may work for one guy may not necessarily work for him, and what may work for one pitcher may not work for the other, because everybody's a little bit different, right? Like what's being thrown at him is not always the same. And so I think the biggest goal for our guys is just putting themselves in a spot to be the best receiver they can be, while understanding like why they're getting into those positions. If they're just mindlessly getting there, then like that's where we have some of the issues when we get those scores back and you say like, hey, you had a rough game. Here's why you got into this position. Why'd you do that? And then they have no reasoning for you. And so making sure we've tried to educate our guys on that more really than anything. And when we explain to them or have them try something new, like, hey, here's what we're thinking. Here's why we're wanting to get here. And we always try to give them that piece of it before just saying, go do this or try this out. I think that's the biggest kick that we always get. It's like a lot of our guys catch on a knee, right? And it's always a topic that always gets asked, and it's always something that I feel like I give them. I don't want to say the same answer, but an answer that I feel like is very honest. Our guys do it because they understand that it has truly impacted and helped them progress as players. We've had guys who have made astonishing, just skyrocketed and flown through organization, not because they got on a knee, but it allowed them to be their best receiver. And do all of our guys do it? Sure. But I always ask the question from the question, hey, listen, if I ask my guys to get back onto 2 feet, I'm not necessarily sure how many guys would just jump whole back into it because of how comfortable they've gotten back on that knee and how well it's allowed them to be a really good receiver. So I think the biggest piece of what we do is just telling guys, hey, here's why we do it. And you're going to have to find a way to work within your game.
No, that's a good answer. You know, I feel like there's a few kind of trends that are kind of taking place right now in the catching world. And I feel like a big one is, you know, maybe where in the past us as coaches used to say, hey, this is how it's done. This is your signal stance, your primary stance, your secondary stance. This is your blocking, you know, excuse me. It was very structured and very, very rigid. I think the new trend is allowing a lot more individuality and trying to let guys, you know, using your word, experiment, you know, with different things and figure out what works best for them. And like you said, what puts them in the best position for them to have success receiving wise. So is that something that, because like I said, I think in the grand scheme of things, that's a very new idea in the catching world. Like I think it used to be rigid, and now guys are really kind of embracing the individuality approach. So when you have, you know, you're not a high school coach that has 4 guys on your staff. You've probably got to manage how many catchers in the minor league? 16 or 18, maybe? Is that?
Yeah, the numbers dwindled a little bit just from the structure of what 2020 looks like and the new player regulations. But last year it was 20.
Okay, so around 20 guys. So you've got a lot of guys to manage, which means there could be a lot of different things going on. How is that something that I guess you either keep organized or keep track of, or just let guys kind of become their own player without having to fit them inside this strict mold?
I think you said it right there, like giving them the autonomy that one, it's their career, and 2, like you have to understand, it goes back to that point, like understanding what really works for them, right? Like, do we have a lot of guys that do similar things? Sure. But it's because they have found ways to make it work within the realm of their game. The easiest way for me to keep track of it is because sometimes players lose track of what they're actually doing, but the player or the coaches do an incredible job of keeping track what those guys are doing. So having some trust in my catching coaches at each level, understanding that they know what we're trying to accomplish. They're pushing the status quo a little bit, but they're also not going so far outside of what we're trying to accomplish that it looks wholesale or there's some big difference from affiliate to affiliate. And so I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. It's been the best way to keep track is just allow the coaches to, in essence, do their job a little bit, but also create those relationships and allow them to be a part of the player's process as well, or growth as well as a player.
Well, I think that's great. I mean, when you trust the guys that you work with, you know, the coaches and the catchers, it allows for a lot better environment where things aren't being micromanaged. Guys don't feel forced. And at the end of the day, like you said, it's their career. You know, they need to do what's best for them and help figure that out. So that's interesting. Earlier you mentioned, you know, when you get a report back about the scoring of the catcher, I would say I'm fairly familiar with what goes on at the big league level. I imagine things are slightly different at the minor league level. Would you mind just kind of explaining how that works? How does the scoring take place, or are they using Hawkeyes in all the minor league ballparks? At which level would that start? And just kind of go over that process for people who might not be familiar with it.
Yeah. So the last minor league season we had, which was 2019, I believe everybody had TrackMan still. Hawkeye might have been making its way into some of the upper affiliates, and just because that was what was looking like was going to be used at the big league level. But in terms of how the scoring goes, it's essentially just taking what is the probability of a pitch being called a strike, and what did we actually get it called, and it's just a credit debit system. Whether or not if we get it called a strike, we get credited. If we get it called the ball, we get docked. And what we get docked or credited is based off the probability of that pitch being called a strike. And then it comes back and takes that number and gives us a receiving score. It gives it, and it's based off the average. If the average catcher was to be catching tonight, you caught this much better than the average. And the average on that scale is very similar to like the WRC plus number, where like average is 100. So for some of the scores you see 105 or 95 or whatever it is, it just means they're a percentage better than the average.
Yeah. I know this is a question that's going to be difficult to answer, but do you ever see that happening at the amateur level, or do you think that's just going to be cost prohibitive and probably just going to, happen in pro ball?
I think it'll happen. I think it's going to be tougher. I think there has to be some creative ways in which you find ways to score the receiving. It was actually a question that I had brought up to a couple buddies who were still in college baseball a few years ago. Like, hey, have you thought of the idea of like trying to grade out your catcher's receiving, and like keep it in simplest terms? Like, you have TrackMan. Is there a way to use that data? I know a couple of them were making some pushes in that direction. A couple of them ended up getting hired into pro ball, so obviously that got halted a little bit. But I think at some point you will see amateur catchers be graded more than what they currently are on the receiving aspect, just because it is seen as such a valuable tool at our level. We do understand the value of it. And so now on the flip side of it, I don't think it's a necessity. I think from a lot of the guys that are in pro ball, the coordinators, the big league coaches, the guys that we have relationships, the guys that have talked to CatcherCon and been on this or been on any other podcast, have the understanding that like the defensive tool is a relatively quick trait to develop versus hitting. Right? And that's not to take a shot at hitting coaches and to say that our job's way easier. It's just to say that you're more likely to see a guy make a quicker adjustment earlier in his career from a defensive standpoint versus like the hitting standpoint, where it seems to be like this continual progress of growth over the course of their minor league career. And you see it in the big league level where guys make drastic jumps from year to year defensively and maintain that. And then, and not saying you don't see it on the hitting side, I just think you see it more from the defensive front. So we have this understanding, we have this belief that the defensive tool is something that can be taught a little simpler, quicker. Guys can develop in that space a little bit faster and boost their career a little bit quicker. So I don't think it's actually like absolutely a necessity at the amateur level. Do I think it'll happen? I think so, but I don't think it's a necessity for players to progress.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting topic. We talk about the differences between pro ball and amateur ball, and possibly what's going to happen in the future with the electronic strike zone. That's kind of a different topic, but I feel like a lot of people say, well, the guys in the big leagues have access to all this data. That's why they're able to change. If I'm a high school guy, I don't have receiving metrics. I don't have a score. I didn't score a 103 last night. Like, there was no TrackMan setup. I didn't have that. But you said you can still judge it and watch and coach by eye. If you have a trained eye, you know what you're looking for. And I just don't want people to lose that because while the tech is really cool and it's really valuable, and it's amazing what they're able to do now that they weren't able to do a few years ago in terms of grading catchers and actually comparing them. I still think it's probably going to be a while. Yeah, like you said, maybe it does happen in amateur, baseball sometime, but it's probably going to be cost prohibitive, at least for a while, if that happens. So I don't think that's a reason to, stop the progress or stop trying just because we don't have access to that. We still got to coach by eye the majority of people out there. I know the guys in pro ball have mountains and mountains of data and information, but a lot of times the guys that are lower levels just don't have that. And it's okay. It's fine. You still got to make do with what you got. Try to watch the guys that are making an impact at your level and big leagues and all that, and try to adapt it to what we're doing, whatever level we're at. So I definitely,
sure.
I like
And
that approach.
And I don't think that and to kind of build off of that piece a little bit, pro ball gets this bad rap sometimes that I think hey, you're a professional baseball, you have all this tech, it always works. Right? There's nights that TrackMan doesn't work, or there's nights that our scores don't come back, and we have to do that piece of it. We have to still have the ability to say hey, I think you had a rougher night, and here's why. Here's some things that attribute to lower scores. Now, we didn't get one for this night, so we have to use our fill. That happens, and we can't just kick it to the side and say that game doesn't exist, because it does. And we still have to find ways to build and grow off of it. So I think you're absolutely right. I think as players and coaches, we have to have an understanding of when we're at our best, when we're not, so that when we do have those game experiences, we can continue to use our eyes and trust ourselves and see what we feel, to know whether or not hey, I had a good night or I had a bad night. Here's why. Here's what I need to get better at. And so I think that's the one thing I think about the most is just because we have it doesn't mean it always works for us.
That's a good point, man. It's a really good point. I think a lot of people, use those things as a crutch sometimes, whether it be a Rapsodo for a pitcher or hit tracks for a hitter or whatever it is, just because the number says this, that doesn't always, good numbers don't always equate to a great performance and so on and so forth. Just because your spin rate is really good that night, you still might get hit around. So, there's a lot going on, and it can be more difficult to evaluate sometimes. I do want to shift gears a little bit though. And, I want to stay on the topic of receiving, but I want to get a little bit more in the nitty gritty and ask you guys what they do. I know we have a lot of individual guys and a lot of guys who are doing things, different but the same, or under the same umbrella, but they're doing things with their own individual twist on them. Are there any particular, drills or exercises that maybe all the guys would go through, or any things that you consider, pillars or fundamentals for the guys? Maybe it's a pregame routine. Maybe that's what they do in the bullpen, or maybe it's, what you take them through in spring training. But are there any things that stays pretty consistent, specifically that maybe somebody listening at home can do? Maybe you guys really like receiving off the high velocity machine. Maybe you guys like receiving with wrist weights. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just curious to know if there's any things that you feel like are kind of top down work for most of your guys.
The one thing I can say we do from all the way down that we do, that every guy does on a consistent basis, we do our pliable routine, we do our bounces, and personally, and I think I've said this before, we try to do everything with a glove on our hand. Only reason for that is just the proprioceptive feel of understanding where the pocket is. I don't care if it's a mini mitt. I don't care if it's a regular glove, if it's a big glove. That doesn't matter to me as much as just having a glove on your hand. The thing I like about the plyo balls is you can do them. You can use different weights. The heavier they are, the more feedback they give. The lighter they are, the less feedback. It allows guys to understand how their body's moving, get into those positions in what I would call low stress environment. Right, you can add a wrist weight to it. You can hook up the J band to it if you want to, but not many of our guys do that, because it is what I would call their prep work, their pregame routine, something that's going to get them going for the rest of the day at the bare minimum. We do have the luxury of using machines, and we do use them as often as possible, because you can increase the velocity, you can maximize pitch shape, in terms of just like making it almost unrealistic to a certain degree. And so we do like doing that on a regular basis because pitchers are trying to throw the ball harder and they're trying to move the ball more. And so when we get into our training environments, we need to try to catch the ball that's firmer and catch the ball that's moving more. And not saying we do that all the time, but there is a time and a space for us to do that pretty regularly, so we get comfortable and working in that environment. I think the last thing I would say in terms of just like something, and I think this is obtainable at any level, is getting guys on the field more than like just getting them into a bullpen or getting them into a cage or getting them into like this very closed environment, to where, hey, we're going to go work on receiving today. Oh, cool. That's great. But by getting them on the field, we can take that receiving drill and add a game like twist to it, mix it up, throw some blocks in there, have them make an actual throw with a runner call. At worst, it gets them in the space where they're going to be working the most often, like behind an actual plate on dirt. And two, the hardest part of the game is completing a play, right? Like we can all play catch, but the hardest part about block recovery and making a throw is like the recovery and throw piece in a timely manner and like getting a guy out. Like we can all sit in a cage and block balls for days. We can all in a very easy environment do our throwing footwork, but once we actually have to start making that throw in like what I would call as a more unpredictable environment, I think that pushes guys further along in their development versus just saying like, hey, we're going to run through some transfers and footwork today, and they stop, right? They lose their rhythm, or we're just going to block some balls today. I think as much as we can get guys on the field and to finish a play, I think that is huge at any age group, at any level. And in my opinion, from the big leagues down.
I love that, and I'll be honest. I think I've thought about it a little bit before, but not really the way that you just described it. And it kind of like a light bulb went off as you're talking about that. I would say you're absolutely right. I mean, of all the position players on the field, you know, a shortstop, he's taking ground balls at shortstop on the game field. The center fielder, he's taking fly balls in center field on the game field. As a catcher, how many times are we actually receiving a pitch, you know, with the pitcher in the batter's eye as our backdrop? I would say almost never, except for scrimmages or inter squads or game situations. You know, we're always doing our receiving work in the bullpen, or we're doing it down the left field or right field line, or we're doing it on a side field or wherever we can. I think that's a really good takeaway that I feel like a lot of guys can benefit from. Like I said, I've always liked doing work on the field, but I've never really thought of it exactly in that way as you just described. And I think that's a pretty wise thing to have guys start doing, is to work more on the field behind home plate, and not just fielding bunts and pop flies, but actually catching, you know, maybe some of the bullpens or some of the live BPs or whatever. So I like that. I'm going to start doing that more with guys. And hopefully some more people will kind of take that same approach. I do want to go back to one other thing you said kind of in that statement. You know, when you talked about receiving plyo balls, I've always liked doing different work with plyo balls. And a lot of people, you know, say it's for strength or for, you know, developing our wrists or our forearms or our hands or whatever it is. But you said the heavier balls give more feedback. And man, that's absolutely right. You know, if we have a poor glove path, or we get long with our mitt, and you have a 1 or 2 pound plyo ball, I mean, that's going to give a lot more feedback than a 5-ounce baseball. So that's another good takeaway that I'm going to continue to keep in the back of my mind, and I hope other people kind of start to implement as well.
Oh yeah.
So
I think the cool thing about plyo balls that I really like is they're simple. Everybody can do it, right? There's from like a feeding standpoint, there's no like, I don't want to say real skill involved, but it's not like you're throwing it from a distance. Like you can flip it underhanded and still accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. And there's so much creativity that can happen within it. I love the feedback it gives, because not only does it tell you where your like if you're catching the ball in the pocket, or you know, your actual movement, and just in terms of like, am I having to like make a negative move away from the zone? It can really play with your timing. Like to be strong with those things, like you have to have good timing to maintain some strength. And for younger kids, I think in general, the biggest issue from like playing sports across the board is purely strength. And it's just an easy way to help them build some strength within the confinements of what they're actually trying to accomplish within the position in a very easy environment, right? And so that's what I love about them. Granted, we do it with our pro ball guys, and strength isn't necessarily an issue, but I think from when we're talking about amateur baseball players, I think it's a very easy way for them to like almost strength train in a catching environment.
Yeah. I still think that's one of those things that more people are buying into it, but I still think there's a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance. You know, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm 5'11" and I weigh 180 pounds and I can't bench press my body weight, well, if I gain 15 pounds and gain 50 pounds on my bench press and my squat goes up, again, that doesn't always necessarily mean that, hey, the more you can squat, the more home runs you're going to hit, you know, or the more you can bench press, the better receiver you're going to be. But there is something to be said. There is a correlation between just overall strength and just athleticism and durability as well. With your guys playing, you know, 140 games in the minor league system, that's a lot of games, and that's a lot of time to get beaten down and broken down. And the crazy thing is a lot of amateur guys are playing that many games as well now too. You know, you see guys in college have a 60 game regular season. Some of the collegiate summer leagues plays, you know, upwards of 60 games, you know, so by the time you have 120 games plus your fall ball, they're playing a lot of baseball. Then you see some high school guys in summer league teams and travel teams. You know, I read something on Facebook the other day that was talking about, I think it was an 11U team that supposedly went 115-0 last year. And I'm thinking, like, what 11-year-old team is playing 115 games? But it's out there. People are playing. You know, and like it or not, you need to have your body prepared for that. Becoming more durable and stronger is a good way to do that. So that's definitely interesting. I do want to shift gears a little bit though, because we've been on for a while. I've been rambling and talking, but I want to talk about throwing a little bit with you. And you know,
Okay.
it seems like throwing it's a little bit lower on people's priority list now than it was a few years ago. You know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, oh man, throwing was it. With the advancements in technology that we talked about earlier, and guys actually be able to score receiving, and now having a real understanding of how valuable the receiving aspect is, it seems like receiving has bumped up to the top of our priority list. Which I'm not saying that's wrong by any means, but there's still, you know, a sector of people who are really trying to focus on their throwing, and they're really trying to get better at it. First of all, I'd like to know, earlier we kind of talked about the difference between, you know, minor league guys or professional guys and amateur guys. When you look at the way that professional catchers throw the ball versus the way that amateur catchers throw the ball, what would be a couple of the main differences you see there?
Accuracy.
Plain and
Simple as
simple, right?
that. I
Yeah.
think the biggest difference, I think plain and simple, I think the biggest difference is in amateur baseball, a lot of guys, and I don't mean this like across the board, but I would say just like at least how I feel, and from being there, it was all about being quick. How quick could I get rid of it? How, you know, what's my pop time look like? And there's a level of that which is important, because I do understand it does, you know, get guys recruited and it gets guys out there and stuff like that. But I can tell you just from my recruiting, my small window of recruiting experience, that the guys who threw a 2 flat on the bag versus a guy that threw a 185 that network like wasn't even close, like, to me, those two guys aren't even in the same ballpark. I'm gonna take the guy who can put it on the bag. And when we watch in the big leagues, like the guys who are the best throwers, I couldn't tell you what their pop times are, but I can tell you that they're really, really accurate, and they can put it within a space that the middle infielder is going to make a play. I think that's what. Now, granted, I think Yadier Molina has one of the better arms ever to play behind the plate, but I think the thing that has made him such a special thrower is that he throws it in a confined window. I think the same thing with Romuto. Like, those are two awful examples because they have absolute cannons, but they're incredibly accurate with how they throw, and that's why they allow themselves to produce some value in that space. And so I just think, plain and simple, like, accuracy. I think the time plays a factor, but I think accuracy plays more of a factor, because you can have the fastest time in the world, but if you don't throw it remotely close, you drastically decrease your chances for throwing guys out.
Yeah, and I'll second that. I want to put a quick story that kind of goes right along with that. When I was in junior college, Roy Oswalt, who ended up being, I think, second in the Rookie of the Year nominations to Albert Pujols back in 2000 or whatever year it was, he would come back. He went to my junior college. So he would come
Mhm.
back and throw bullpens in the fall. So I got to catch him, as an 18, 19-year-old young player, getting to catch a guy who's a future, MLB all-star. I learned a lot. And so I'm catching him in the bullpen, and he would say, set up outside and do all this stuff. And if he missed his spot, I'm not joking. If he missed his spot by more than a couple inches, I mean, like this, he would be like, you see his body language, he'd be like, damn, and he'd be like, I missed my spot. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
like, we don't have a guy on our team that is that close. The level of accuracy and level of precision is absolutely freaky. And that's a pitcher, but I do think the same rule applies to catchers. When you watch those guys throw, they're
Mhm.
throwing it pretty much on the bag. Yeah, I know you can go through and find videos, and there might be a ball that bounces here and there, but there is rarely a ball that just flies arm side high into center field. It's unbelievable how accurate those guys are, and I'm really glad you said that, because that's one of those things that most people just don't focus on enough. Is there anything other than other than just being, hey, this guy's an accurate thrower, this guy's not an accurate thrower? Is there anything you've done or you've found that can maybe help somebody with that? And I'll go ahead and start and say that I think for me the number one thing is just having a focus on it and having an interest in it, and being concerned about becoming a more accurate thrower, and actually, I hate to say, putting an effort and really trying. But is there anything that you would maybe add on top of that that you think can help a guy become more accurate?
Yeah, I think one of the I'll say two things. Uh, the first one I think we're always constantly trying to find, and it's our rhythm with our throwing from a crouched position. Right, we're constantly trying to find like a good rhythm when we throw to get everything off on time. I think that absolutely helps us with our accuracy, because I would second that for what you just said. Like, putting a focus on it is key, and then finding the rhythm to allow you to do that often, I think is one piece. I think the second piece, and this is where I think a lot of catchers, and I'm including professional catchers, I think just catchers in general, um, guys who have like bad directional issues, or like challenges in terms of like maintaining direction towards second base, where they're not like working towards third to throw back across their body or vice versa. Um, those guys have a more inconsistent like accuracy, or their window tends to be a little bit more sprayed versus a guy who stays within. I'll use the batter's boxes as like the guideline, but stays within that space of working towards second base. Typically tend to throw in a little tighter window. And is it perfect? No. Do you see guys that step way behind them and throw it on the bag? Absolutely. But I think overall, in general, the more guys can stay more directionally towards the bag, or the target in which they're trying to throw to, the better chance they have of being accurate. Um, always use like throwing like back picking to first base as like the example. I think back picking to first base is a great skill to have, but I think it's less about the actual speed as it is more about like the ability to throw the ball in a taggable zone. And in order to do that, you have to be able to create your direction towards first. And and I use that example because it's the toughest place for right-handed catchers to turn all the way around and throw. So I think just being like having a directional focus as well, making sure that we can stay within that lane is key, or is huge for that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I work with mostly guys that are a little bit younger now. I work with some college guys and occasionally a pro ball guy, but for the most part, I'm spending most of my time with amateur players. And there's a big difference between, if I had to, put a name on it or a label, say top tier amateur players and guys who are trying to get to that next level, I guess, there's a lot more body awareness. There's a lot more balance. There's a lot more direction. Just like you see a guy swinging in the box, when a guy swings and falls all over the place, it's going to be harder for him to square the ball up consistently, where you see a guy that can swing as hard as he
Mhm.
can and he can stay planted on 2 feet, ready for the next swing. I think the same thing holds true with guys that are throwing. Guys who have a good follow through and their body's working, through their target, they're naturally going to be a little bit more accurate than guys just have less body awareness and body control, and kind of start going haywire, especially on a pitch that's not right down the middle. if the pitch is,
Yep.
a little bit to my arm side or to my glove side, now it's like, holy cow, my body doesn't know what to do. And I start going all over the place, and that's when throws really start to sail on us. So that's interesting. Now, over the past couple of years, I've been predicting something that hasn't necessarily come true yet, but I want to ask you, and I think you're the right guy to ask. My prediction is that as time progresses and we see more guys catching in a one knee stance or a knee down stance, or this hybrid setup we've got now, I predicted that we're going to see more guys shift into throwing from their knees. And it hasn't necessarily happened yet, but I think it's kind of a natural progression. And I've worked with a lot of guys who surprisingly throw as well or better from their knees than they do from their feet. Now, there is a certain skill set required. You definitely have to. There is a floor of arm strength level that you have to accomplish that. If you don't have that arm strength level, then it's not going to work. And most younger guys
Mm-hmm.
don't. If you're in high school, you probably just haven't developed that arm strength yet. If you're in college, you might have gotten there. But some of the guys that have stronger arms and who are capable and can meet that floor, they're able to throw better from their knees. Is that something you guys have experimented with at all, or do you have anybody that throws from their knees? Maybe not all the time, but at certain times.
Yeah, I think a couple of our guys, I would say, probably do it more than others. And I think some of it's just from a comfort thing. I think for the longest time, catchers have always been told they have to throw from their feet, and it's just something that it's been ingrained into our brains. So we do it instinctually, whether or not we know we're actually doing it. Now, I do have some guys who do have a feel and understand, like, oh, this pitch is down, the guy took off. If I stand up, I have no chance. So let me just stay down and go. And they have the arm strength. I think you're absolutely right, though. I think you'll start to see more guys experiment with it. I don't think you'll see somebody completely throw off their knees or even be on the latter side of 70% off their knees, but I think you'll see that creep to more 50-50. And I think it's just going to be a comfort thing. I think it's going to be probably pitch location dependent, just to some degree. But I do think you'll see more guys do it. And it's not like it doesn't happen. I just think you'll see more guys across the board do it more often.
Yeah.
Especially the more guys do get down there.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. Like I said, I wouldn't say it's taking hold widespread, and there's a lot of guys doing it. But for me, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's pitch dependent, or location dependent. When that pitch is in the right spot, I'd be curious to know. Maybe we can touch base again in another couple of months after spring training. Hopefully, goes off on track, and maybe I can pick your brain a little bit more about it then. But I just think it's interesting. I think it's one of those things that I think there's potential there, and I think a lot of people are scared to try it because of that stigma. Hey, I'm supposed to throw from my feet. It looks lazy if I throw from my knees, but that's really kind of the same stigma that was taking place a couple of years ago, as a lot of guys in the Twins organization kind of started to really push the envelope and receive from a knee down stance. So like I said, I've been curious to see how that progresses and where that goes. And I'm curious to kind of watch pro ball. The one thing that can get in the way of that, I think, is if the electronic strike zone, comes into play, and if that starts, if that changes guys' stances and changes guys' positions, that might kind of throw a wrinkle in my theory. But at least that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. I'm putting it in writing, and that's what I'm going with. So. But kind of on that note, are there any topics, or because we don't have a whole lot of time left, I want to be respectful of your time, but are there any things, is there anything that you've noticed in the catching world, maybe a direction that you see catching going, and maybe it's specific to receiving or stances or throwing or whatever, but is there anything that if you had to make a prediction, or you say, hey, I think catching is moving this direction and it's a good thing, or maybe you see some other things on the opposite side, I see a lot of catchers doing this, and I think that's a bad thing. Just kind of the overall state of catching. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll say this to start off. I think the catching position itself is in the best position it's been probably ever. I think we're starting to see more people invest and dive into the position in terms of just purely educational and understanding what we're trying to accomplish. But I think for me, the biggest thing that sticks out in terms of where I could see, the conversation heading. What's next, right? What's next on the docket for catchers? And I think we've gotten to a place where we start to understand that, like, hey, maybe the knee down stuff isn't for everybody, but maybe it is for someone, right? And or finding that best receiving stance is the key piece to it. I think the next part is, and where you've seen guys ask the question or talk more, is what about blocking, right? Throwing always gets brought up as the hot topic because for amateur players, it's how they get recruited in a large scale because it's the easiest metric to record, and it's easy to see on TV. It's you can pull it up on Baseball Savant or Baseball Practice and see guys throwing stuff. I think blocking is the next thing, and I think that's probably the space. And I don't say this badly, but where I think you have two almost completely different thoughts, right? In terms of everything's blockable versus, hey, let's block what we should be able to block, right? Or block within the confinements of what we're capable of doing. So do I think we'll meet in the middle? Probably not, but I think that's the next space. And I think finding ways for the guys that are on a knee or are in this single primary stance, ways to better position themselves to be more or be better blockers, because the moment you get on a knee, everybody's like, you're not going to be a good blocker. Well, it's like, well, let's just find a way to still accomplish that. Versus the other side of it, it's like, let's maintain that thought of being able to block everything while still being able to receive, which we know is where our values from. And so I think both sides will learn from each other, but I think me personally, I would be surprised if we didn't see a lot of conversation start to stem that direction here in the next 6, 8, 10, 12 months.
I agree. So I've seen that, argument / discussion online a number of times. And I feel like I kind of fall slightly on one side or the other, but where do you fall on that as far as everything's blockable, or, hey, we got to block what we can block and everything else is just kind of, chalk it up to guys throwing 98 miles an hour now with guys throwing 93 mile an hour sliders? What do you think, or your thoughts on that?
I would personally, I wouldn't necessarily float on the side of everything's blockable. I'd probably float on the other side of it. And the reason I say that is because there's just balls that are outside the capabilities of, regardless of what stance you're in, you're just not going to get to, not going to keep in front of you. With the ultimate goal of like preventing the guy running, I think that there's just balls that are almost, and I won't say always or impossible, but there's 0.0001 chance you keep it in front and the guy doesn't go. And so because of that, I think I float on the side more of like, let's control the highest percentage of space in which we know balls are going to go based off who's on the mound. That's kind of where I float more towards. I think we'll see more trends in that direction. I think we'll put ourselves in a better position to actually block more pitches, personally. Yeah, that's just kind of the space that I've kind of floated to a little bit more, the more I've kind of dug and thought about it.
Yeah, for me, it's one of those tricky things. It's, sometimes reality doesn't always line up with the theory. I buy into the theory that the catcher should have the mindset that every time the pitcher throws the ball, I'm going to catch it if it's in the air, and if it's not in the air, I'm going to stop it. That's my job. That's what I'm going to try to do. I don't like necessarily building in, I hate to say excuses, but I don't like telling guys like, hey, if it's in this batter's box, you don't have to block it and this and that. I just like them having the mentality of, I'm going to try to keep everything in front. But then there's also the reality of it, like, hey, that pitch was 93 spiked in the other batter's box. Like, I've tried to block that pitch. Like, it's not happening, so I like the approach of, I'm going to try to block everything, but I also like, the understanding of how difficult it is, especially at the level that, you're coaching guys where you have professional athletes and pitchers who have absolutely filthy stuff, who are throwing really hard. It's not as easy as it looks. It's easy to sit on my side of a computer and critique a guy when a ball goes to the backstop, but when you're behind the dish, it's kind of a different story.
Yeah, it's tough. And I was actually texting with a guy the other night, and he was like, I tell my guys that blocking is a mentality. And I told him, hey, listen, I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I was like, I can get anybody to block a baseball. I can get anyone to body a ball. Whether they like it or not is totally different. but I can get anyone to do that. I think blocking is a real skill. Like, there is an art to it. I think it is the fact that the guys who are really good do it differently than the guys that are bad. And the guys that are good are able to prevent guys from running. And they do it because the ball doesn't trickle away. That's it. Right? They have this innate ability to control the baseball. And I think just saying, like, I think just with the idea or the mentality of like blocking the ball or bodying the ball, I think there is a time and a place for it, especially when kids are younger, getting them to understand, like, hey, it's not as bad as what it might seem. But I think as we start to understand, like, truly what we're trying to accomplish, that it is a real skill. I can say from personal experience, like, I didn't mind getting hit by the ball. I let the ball hit off me all day, but I can't tell you I was a good blocker. As I got older, did it get better? Absolutely. But I think the skill is like figuring out how to keep it closer to make that second play. And that's just kind of where I've landed, where my headspace has been at, just in terms of this piece of it. Am I saying I'm right? No. I'm also not saying the other side's wrong either. So it's just kind of how I viewed it.
Well, I definitely see that. And I think I mentioned at CatcherCon a couple of years ago, I can't remember if it was in a roundtable discussion or during a presentation. But one of the things that I asked you a question a few minutes ago is where do you see catching going, or what would you like to see change? And you mentioned blocking, and I completely agree. One of the things I've always thought is kind of crazy is, if you go look at the if you pull up MLB TV and look at StatCast, you can find the most obscure statistics ever, like, hey, this ball, the pitcher ran the farthest to catch a ball in foul territory, like the third baseman threw the ball in this distance and in a dome with the wind, and like, it's like crazy how detailed they get. When it comes to blocking statistics, only recently have people even just measured just the number of blocking attempts. And one thing you don't see yet is, and I'm hoping it trends in that direction, I'm hoping we start to see things like, hey, this is the average amount of time it took since the ball hit him for the catcher to actually retrieve it. If we had a hard number, like, hey, this guy is a 1.3 seconds, this guy is a 4.2 seconds, holy cow, that's a pretty measurable statistic that we can look at. Another one might be, how far does the ball actually roll away from him? And I know that sounds crazy and hard to measure, but man, with the technology in the big leagues right now, I have no doubt that if one of those programmers, wanted to look that up, they could do that. And maybe some teams are doing that now. I haven't heard of anybody doing that yet, but those are the two things that I would love to see. The time it takes catchers to recover the ball, and then the distance that the ball on average actually travels away after it hits us. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, for the runner not to advance, the quicker we can field the ball, he's going to have less opportunity to run. So those are a couple things that I'm hoping happen fairly soon on the blocking front. So I'm gonna need you to get with your R&D guys, and you make that happen for me, so I can look like I predicted it.
Okay. No, I don't disagree with that one bit. And I think what that would actually do is, when we talk about the automated strike zone that everybody sees coming up in the future, right? Like, it's more around the corner than I think we've ever or we want to admit. But I think there's been the thought of, oh, automated strike zone, receiving doesn't matter, we can stick anybody back there. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. And I think having measurables like that allow for the right guy to be back there, right? Allow for those, and I'm all about transitioning a guy from an infield position to behind the plate, or from wherever he's at. But not every infielder makes a good catcher, right? Or not every other guy can just get behind the dish and then like corral that ball or make a good throw, because it is different. And so I think what that does is it still keeps some honesty about the position a little bit, right? It doesn't open up to just being an absolute free for all. They're like, we'll just throw him behind the plate, he'll be good. So I think that's a step in terms of that could help the catching position almost stay. I'll use the word like a fraternity, to where it's a unique group of guys that want to truly get back there.
Yeah, it's going to be there'll be some interesting changes, as we see that start to get implemented. I'm with you. I do think there's going to be a little bit of a shift away from defense and towards offense, where you try to make it more of an offensive position. And that doesn't mean, hey, you stick the first baseman back there. It means, hey, now there's probably a guy in AAA that can really smash, but he can't catch, and he's getting a shot. So it's not just like, hey, let's put the big fat guy who can rake behind the dish, but you're going to see less of an emphasis on some of the defensive stuff. So, but yeah, I think people underestimate, having that conversation, how difficult the catching is, especially the receiving and the blocking. And hey, if we're talking about, trying to catch the balls that clip the bottom of the automated zone, those pitches are difficult. I mean, a lot of those pitches are sometimes, clip, especially the breaking balls, they're clipping the bottom of the zone, and that might even bounce, that you have to pick. And then trying to block those, it's going to be challenging. So I'm interested to see where that goes as well. I think there will be some shift. I think something will happen for sure. I don't think it's going to be quite as dramatic as everyone, or as a lot of people may think it is. But it's interesting. It's an interesting conversation to have, and I'm interested to see, kind of where that goes. So
for sure.
But man, Michael, I appreciate it. Like, so we've been on here a little bit over an hour, and we could probably talk all day about all these different things. But I appreciate you coming on, and definitely appreciate you being here. One thing I forgot to ask you earlier, I'll put it on the screen. But for people who would like to find you online, I know you're on Twitter. If you wouldn't mind just mentioning where people can find you, and I'll put it on the screen, and then let them hit you up.
Yeah, so where I do most of my interaction with everybody's on Twitter, and it's at Micheal_T42.
And I'll go ahead and
open. I try to get back. Go ahead. I was gonna say I try to get back to everybody that asked me questions. I posted a comment just kind of messing around with my kid with a reflex ball, and everybody's like, "What's this reflex ball you're talking about?" So, no, so.
Well, I'll put it on the screen so nobody can miss it. But it's Micheal, Micheal, right? Okay.
Yeah, that it is.
There we go. So, all right, well, Michael, man, I appreciate it. Like I said, I definitely appreciate the time. I know you're a busy guy, especially as you're getting ready to take off for spring training. I know you got a lot to work to do. But man, I appreciate the time, and I enjoyed speaking with you. I learned a lot, and interested to talk with you again soon.
Absolutely. No, thanks for having me on. Hope we can connect here soon, and you're 40 minutes down the road, get face to face at some point.
I know, right? We got to make that happen before you leave for spring training. We're definitely going to do it
for sure.
So, all right, man. Thanks. I appreciate it.